Okay, great. Well, thank you, Margaret, for that, and welcome everyone. We are glad to see you here, and we are going to get right into it. If we go to the next slide, we can just introduce myself, and then I think hopefully you know, I'm Anna Richards. I'm president of the Chapel Hill-Carrboro NAACP. And I've been working with a number of other branches in the NAACP to put together this law enforcement transformation agenda. And so those folks have been a part of this. We'll talk more about that later. But today I'm going to be having a conversation with Chief Blue of the Chapel Hill Police Department. And Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Anna. It's good to be with you and everybody on this call today. Just a quick intro on me. Grew up in Chapel Hill, graduated from Chapel Hill High School, went to UNC, got a degree there in broadcasting, and after doing a couple jobs after college, came to work for the town in 1997, July of 1997, sworn in as a police officer, November of that same year, and been here ever since, been serving as chief for almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years December 1st. So pleasure to be with you, excited about the opportunities for us to reimagine how we do policing in this community and beyond, and look forward to today's conversation.
Great, thank you. So the next chart we have just a little kind of review of where we are in the process. So I mentioned earlier that it was really after George Floyd's murder that the NAACP in Chapel Hill, in Northern Orange, and in Chatham community, and Chatham County came together and said, you know, what can we do? What should we do? How do we address these issues in our community? And so together we put this agenda together, which we think captures some of the national issues as well as our concerns here locally. And we'll be going through that a lot more detail. But after we created it, we had a meeting with all the law enforcement heads, including the DA, and we reviewed that agenda with them, and we asked them to respond. And the last time we had a community meeting was when we shared that agenda with the community, and that was a couple months back now. Well, since then, all the law enforcement agencies in our 2 counties have now responded, and we're going through them one by one, and we're having individual meetings with the different leaders and trying to get a good understanding. So it's been kind of a slow process, but we want to do a thorough job, and we'll be talking more about that today. But what we also then had the town of Chapel Hill and all others. We're just talking about Chapel Hill here today, but we also had town resolutions in Carrboro as well. But the town of Chapel Hill passed a resolution back in June, and we'll be talking a little bit about that today because that's really a part of the activity that's going on. And what we really want to do today is, even though we're not finished with our review or with our recommendations, we want to come back, have a chance to share with you where we are, both from the NAACP standpoint, as well as from the town of Chapel Hill standpoint. And Chief Blue can answer questions as well as I can about what their response said or didn't say. And I hope that you all will take advantage of this opportunity to ask questions. Chris, do you want to add anything else in this at this point?
No, that was pretty thorough. I appreciate the opportunity to have some Q&A though. I'll just quickly touch on council's resolution. You mentioned that before council's summer break, they did pass a resolution like many communities did to try to take some action on the heels of some really disturbing national events involving law enforcement and the communities they serve. Our council's resolution called for the assembly of an awful lot of data about our work and the outcomes of our work, about staffing levels, about how we spend money, made some really explicit, gave us some really explicit guidance on some policy changes around use of force and around traffic stops. And we'll get to say more about that as we move forward. And I think also maybe most excitingly, they established a task force that will help lead the community in reimagining what public safety might look like in Chapel Hill. And toward the end of our discussion today, we'll make sure folks know how they can apply for that task force and begin to keep up with the work that's happening there. What I think is interesting about the task force particularly is because as we go through our discussion today, we'll talk about the NAACP agenda, we'll talk about the law enforcement response, but to me, the thing I'm most interested in is talking about where do we go and where are the opportunities for improvement and for transformation. And I think the task force will really help us lead the way in that regard. So I appreciate the council setting up something that will be, I think, meaningful and powerful and will allow us to really continue to be leaders in this area. So look forward to the discussion today.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's go. Next chart. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this agenda. So just for continuity's sake, we included the exact charts that we had in the agenda. And we only have an hour and a half. And so what our focus is going to be, we're going to summarize the way we're going to work today. We're going to summarize each element of the agenda with more emphasis on some parts of it than others. And we're going to look at the first three elements in depth. And the first one, again, was around use of force. And so, you know, as we look across the country at some of these disastrous events and abuses that have taken place, most of them come out of an use of force. And so we had that as our number one. And one item that has been, wasn't in the original, so we don't have it here, but was an oversight really, was also around entry, the Breonna Taylor situation. So we need to address that. It wasn't part of the original agenda. But so the first element that we're going to talk about is looking at use of force policy. So this was our first chart. First of all, talked about continuum. Second of all, talking about mutual assistance agreements. Then on the next chart, we have talking about making sure that when we do have a use of force, that it's reviewed, looking at police departments banning chokeholds, demanding and a duty to intervene, and then militarization programs. So that's the quick overview of what we had in our original agenda. Now, if you go to the next chart, you'll see where we want to focus today. So here we tried to summarize, and we've got multiple charts here. So the way we have this set up, so on the one side, you'll see use of force, and I've basically just taken the elements that we talked about in our original agenda. So the continuum, the mutual assistance, the review, and then we wanted to have on one sheet a summary of the Chapel Hill response to that. So I'm going to pause here and let you look again. The bullets are really the elements that we had in our agenda to start out with. And I'm going to let the chief talk about what the Chapel Hill Police Department's response was to those things.
I will kind of stick to the bullets that are on here, but I think we'll get to elaborate even more when we get to the transformational part here. So the the transformation agenda talked about a use of force continuum with at least 6 steps. And over the years, so I've been with the department for 23 years, we've had different models, force use models that we've adopted or trained on over the years. And perhaps not surprisingly to you all, conventional wisdom about the best way to train and to help people think about uses of force changes over time. So although we don't use a continuum right now, we did when I first got hired, now we use something called the force wheel, and it essentially does the same thing as a continuum. It reminds you that there are force options and that the overriding principle in any encounter where force is warranted is that you use the least amount possible, and that you de-escalate as quickly as possible. And that's really what all of these instruments are intended to train officers to do. In addition to that particular instrument, where I think you get the most impact is on doing scenario-based training where officers get to practice those skills. We're fortunate that we have an interactive video simulator here in our building with literally thousands of videotaped scenarios, encounters, and officers can, and it's room size, and officers can actually interact with that machine, talk to it, back away from it or step towards it. And as they do that, the video circumstances change. And it gives you a really good opportunity to evaluate an officer's ability to decide to escalate or de-escalate. Give them an opportunity to, by the way, it records every interaction. So you can go back and look at it and troubleshoot and provide feedback. And so I don't want to get bogged down on one instrument over another. What I'd rather focus on is de-escalation and minimal use of force as an overarching priority, and then practicing that and reinforcing the good behaviors that tend to reduce the use of force. So that was maybe more than you wanted to know about which instrument we use, but I wanted to share that with you. I think something that's really important, and we'll spend more time on this in the transformation part of this discussion, is also that every use of force is evaluated. And in our department, and I'm speaking about our department right this minute, and then we'll speak about what might be going forward shortly. You need to review every use of force if you want to send a message to both your community and your employees that you recognize those are opportunities where disastrous outcomes can happen. And so, and for many, many years in our organization, every single use of force must be documented. We've got a long policy that talks about the documentation that's required. Supervisors must come to a scene when force has been used, and body camera footage is captured. Statements are taken from any witnesses, including officers who were on the scene. And then actually a review of every single use of force happens with that officer's supervisors, with our Office of Professional Standards. We do have a sergeant here whose sole job is to monitor our performance, ensure that we're complying with our policies, ensure that we're doing all of these performance reviews appropriately. And so every use of force goes into a software product that we have where those statements can go, information about the encounter can go, body camera footage, any relevant interviews that occurred as part of the review and investigation. And that's reviewed all the way up to through the chain of command, through our legal team, and ultimately to me to approve or to not approve. I will tell you, and this perhaps will be no surprise, that that's not true in every department. And I think that's an opportunity as we talk about transformation for us to dive into that a little bit more. There are some efforts at the statewide level to bring some consistency there. Choke holds and knee holds. Obviously, we all of us were horrified to see George Floyd killed, not only killed by an officer, but having others standing around seemingly doing nothing to intervene at all. part of our June 24th resolution that our council passed included explicitly banning those kinds of holds for use by our officers. Those are not holds that we've used ever. And therefore they weren't found in our policy at all, any place, because they were not something that we used. Council changed that. Council asked us to make explicit in our policies that we don't use those and that they are strictly prohibited. And although we didn't get the policy language right at first, it is right now. And there's no misunderstanding about that. Finally, I wanted to talk about militarization because that was a key part of the platform that all of the agencies filled out. And I think that's one of those that is worth a continued community conversation, not because I'm advocating that we participate in militarization programs, but because it's one of those terms that folks don't always necessarily have the same understanding of when they talk about no militarization. To be clear, there are agencies, in fact, some very close by to us, that have sent employees overseas even to participate in training programs that I believe are the kinds of things folks are opposed to when they talk about no militarization programs. And we'd be clear, we don't do any of that. On the other hand, we do have gear and we do have equipment that also I think comes to mind when people talk about militarization. And I think that's the kind of stuff that's important for us to continue to talk about as a community. We have it for important reasons, for important safety reasons. And I think we manage that equipment admirably and carefully and respectfully, and that you don't see it any place you shouldn't see it. If you see that differently, we should hear about that. We want to hear about that. We also want to demystify the equipment, and I would encourage folks to participate in our community police academies. We do, when we're not in the midst of a pandemic, we do 2 of those a year, and we'll show you every single thing we have. We'll explain it to you, do some demonstrations for you about why we think it's important to have some of these capabilities. And speaking of capabilities, you know, we've all seen SWAT teams on television. You know, we have one of those. The good news is, and I'm knocking on wood, we don't see them very often. We don't use them very often, but they do have very specific and important applications from time to time. And so we do have one of those teams. And those are also the kinds of organizations or units that I think people think about when they talk about militarization. So I encourage, I'll certainly appreciate any questions folks have, but also encourage people to come to our community academy. I'm hoping by the spring we'll be able to offer these again, and you'll get to see all of this equipment. The good news is you don't see this stuff very often, which means that we have it, but it's not out there in a way that is divisive in our community, I don't think. So we'll look forward to hearing your feedback on that.
Okay, great. Well, one of the questions then becomes, so when we talk about transformation, and we were very deliberate in our naming of the agenda, not to say reform, because what we're thinking about is the fact that reform efforts have been underway for many years. Things like, you know, body cameras, for instance. People thought that a few years back that if we just had body cameras, there'd be all the problems of the world would be solved, because but what we learned is that you know, most of these instances, people had body cameras on, or they had them on, they wore them, but they didn't have them on. And so if we're really talking about transformation, a couple ideas that we have here is that we think that across North Carolina, there needs to be consistent record keeping on use of force and consistent policies, because what we have now is that even in our small county, we may have one policy in Chapel Hill, and we may have another policy in Orange County, or Hill-Carrboro, or Hill-Carrboro, and not only that, in the case that a lot of people cite around mutual assistance agreements, for instance, is the incident that happened at UNC with the folks from Greensboro. And so if we had a consistent North Carolina practices and record keeping and policy on some of these things, then that would be transformational because we wouldn't be worried about jurisdictional lines. The other thing is that if we were again talking about transformation, some people say, well, the police are reviewing the police. Is that really going to give us a true picture of what's going on? So transformational process might be having a third party come in and do audits of use of force, and not only just keep the numbers, but do analysis on it. If we think about here in our community on traffic stops, for instance, even though records had been kept, it wasn't until we had a professor at UNC, a third party, come in and do some analysis that we really understood what the data was telling us. So a transformational process might be having periodic audits and analysis of that information. And then in terms of tools, having, again, standard tools across jurisdiction so that we would, again, not have to worry if we're in one community or another in terms of how law enforcement and safety would be administered. So if you go to the next chart, we're ready for questions on use of force.
Anna,
sure, go ahead.
Well, just on the transformations, I want to provide a little more information before we get to questions, because I think it's important.
You want to go back to that transformation slide. Thank you.
Because I really appreciate the points you made, and I want to emphasize them, because an awful lot of what I also am hearing from community members, as I know many on this call have too, or have asked themselves, is, all right, so we maybe identify some ideas. What do we do with these ideas? And particularly around use of force, Anna hit on some important things. And I touched on it a little bit in my comments before. What we know is that every department you visit will have a slightly different policy around use of force. And not only that, they'll very likely have slightly different definitions of use of force. What is a use of force to begin with? And that can vary widely. The review process can vary widely. Ours is very rigorous, and I have to tell you, it's probably the exception, to be quite honest with you. And using the example that Anna provided before, we collect an awful lot of information in law enforcement. We write reports about everything. And back in 1999, when our legislature passed a law that required us to collect in a systematic way and submit information about our traffic stops, we thought we might be on the way to getting some really good analysis of outcomes. What we know, and as Anna said, that all that data sat somewhere until about 10 years later, when a UNC professor decided to do something with it. And prior to that, nobody was looking at it, or if they were, they weren't telling any of us about what they had learned. I would submit to you that the same thing needs to happen around use of force in terms of standardized information collection, standardized definitions and thresholds, and then some analysis and feedback from which we can make policy refinements or consider alternative ways of doing our job. Now, I am encouraged and hopeful, and this is where the call to action comes on this slide, is that probably many of you have heard about the Governor Cooper's executive order that established a task force on criminal justice reform. That's not exactly the name of it, but that gets us there. In that same executive order, he also established a group called the Center for the Reduction of Law Enforcement Use of Force. Actually, I'm an appointee to that group. And we'll be having this very conversation and hopefully making recommendations that will find their way into the legislative agenda in this next session around some of these very issues. So what I would say, and I will work hard and work through Anna to try to keep our community apprised of where those conversations are going and where you can lend your voice. But what I do know is, and as Anna said before, if we don't have good data about how we're behaving, not just as a town, but as a profession, and seeing where we can improve systems, then we're going to continue to have irregular interventions that I think fail to get at more systemic issues that I think we all want to tackle. So that call to action is, number one, hold us accountable on sharing information with you about the status of that work, but then also speak with your elected officials and talk with legislators. And when you see conversations happening about bringing some consistency across the state in this very important area, please be heard.
Okay, so I want to go to questions. So we have a question from Lucy Lewis, and she is asking, given the actions of UNC police recently during the Silent Sam protest, what would be the policy today for the Chapel Hill Police Department in terms of interacting with students? And Lucy, if I didn't reflect that properly, you can raise your hand there and be unmuted if there's more you want to add. But I think that I'll try to get the essence of it. So Chris, do you want to respond there?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's an important question. I think mutual aid agreements comes up a little bit later in our discussion today too. And a review of our mutual aid agreements is also spelled out in our council's resolution as an item of interest to them. You know, state law, just very quickly, state law allows police agencies to enter into agreements with each other to provide assistance. And there are times that is necessary. And I'll give you an example. In our community, in a normal year when we have a large scale Halloween event, for example, we couldn't successfully work one of those events without assistance from surrounding agencies. And we tend to request assistance from agencies that reflect our similar approach to how we like to work those events and the way we like to interact with the people we serve. And from year to year, we can pretty consistently count on those same handful of agencies who we think act just as we would want them to act. Now, the state law that allows for those agreements to exist also says that the agency that is requesting those, requesting the assistance is the command or lead agency. So if we invite Carrboro to come help us on Franklin Street with Halloween, they essentially give us staff, and their staff members operate under our chain of command, our rules, and they follow our direction. So when we go to assist in another jurisdiction, including on university's campus here, the same holds true. I do think, I mean, you know, talking about Silent Sam and the events leading up to and immediately after Silent Sam, there was a lot of community concern about how officers interacted there. We've had many, many conversations with our UNC colleagues since then about how we can ensure that we're all behaving the same way and behaving appropriately. Ultimately, I think that comes to, and this is no commentary other than to say this sentence, I think that comes down to leadership and planning. And I have great confidence in our relationship with UNC and with their still relatively new chief, David Perry. But I think we have to look at every single request for our assistance and evaluate whether we should be there or not. There are times that we get invited to other parts of the state to assist with things that we know are not going to be led the way we would want to, lead it, and we don't go.
Okay, we're going to move to any other questions. So I'm saying here in the chat, it says, so in other words, Chapel Hill Police Department will have mutual assistance agreements with other agencies like UNC Campus Police who don't have same policies, reuse of force, or with Greensboro Police. So I think that what you said, that's how it was heard. I'll just say that to you, Chris. And I think the questioner is, and I have another question coming up here, the same, people are wanting to get a more definitive. And now what I heard you also say is that the resolution also asks you to look at mutual assistance agreements.
And I appreciate Lucy's follow-up, so thank you for that. I mean, I think the short answer is, absent some of that standardization we talked about, then we run the risk of of participating in mutual aid settings with organizations that don't have all the same policies. And sometimes that's unavoidable. And sometimes the fact that the policies are different isn't necessarily anything to be concerned about. But when it comes to use of force, as her question said, certainly that's something to be concerned about. So I agree, great question. That's exactly why I think some of this standardization is so important.
I have one more question from Quentin Harper. It's what community education is being done to help community folks who have encounters with law enforcement understand the force wheel. So in the back on our use about the question about the continuum, your response was that you use a force wheel, and are you educating the community on that?
No, but we certainly can. And I think this kind of discussion helps us identify areas where we need to do some work. I don't want to load too much on where our task force goes in the fall, but I believe that that's the kind of thing that our task force might identify for community listening sessions, and we could dive in into the policy, into our training, into our practice, into our evaluation. That wheel is in our policy manual, and it is on our website. However, if you don't know what you're looking at, you don't have some context for it, it probably wouldn't mean to you. So that's a good question. I would welcome the opportunity in a setting like this or some other setting to dive in a little more deeply, and maybe that's something our task force can take up.
We have a question here about mentally ill individuals. And so as we go forward with in our agenda, we talk a little bit more about the crisis unit. So I'm going to put that question for that. And then, and we also have a question. So I'm writing down this mental health, and we talk more about that coming up under another area. So I'm not going to forget you there. And then, but we do have a couple, and we also have a question about a task force and the police advisory board. And that also is one of our areas that we'll cover later. But the other one related directly to use of force is, can you describe the kinds of uses of force that occur in Chapel Hill? What kind of use of force happens in our town?
Sure. Well, thankfully, we don't have lots of uses of force. And most of it, and again, it very much depends in our department, anything other than softly putting your hands on someone to guide them towards the curb or maybe into the back of a police car, really anything more than just a touch on the shoulder, we document and investigate. And thankfully, most of those uses of force are maybe slight pressure on someone's shoulder who doesn't want to go along with an officer. I'm pleased to say that very rarely do we have serious uses of force where there's baton strikes, even taser deployments. We document even a threatened use of a taser, for example. That's a use of force to us. If you take your weapon or your taser out and threaten the use of it, we document that and we evaluate it. So there's information, we do a quarterly report that you can find on our website. It's usually about 6 or 8 months behind because it takes some time to assemble the data and do the analysis and publish, but you can get more information about our uses of force in our community and some of the outcomes there. I'm glad to say that thankfully we don't have to use it very often. And what we also know is that there are times we do. It's never pleasant. And it also never looks good, which is why de-escalation is always our objective and our priority.
So maybe one of the questions about that is the visibility of that data. And I know that we've gotten feedback that it's sometimes hard to get to. And so one of our recommendations that for consideration is having that data where it's more visible and easier to see. Okay, so we got a few, we don't have any more direct questions right now on use of force, so we're gonna keep moving so we can get to our other elements. And I haven't forgotten the task force question and also the mental health question. We'll come back to those a little bit later here. Those are specific things that we have want some more conversation about. So, okay, well, let's go to our second item. So we've talked a little bit about transformation and data collection here. And one of the elements that we are really trying to get to is accountability. So how do you have accountability if you can't really see what's going on? And so we asked that there be a review of the North Carolina Open Records Act so that we could understand what kinds of disciplinary actions are being taken and what kind of misconduct. And then also looking at wanting to know if there are officers who have excessive force complaints, that they be fired. And we wanted stop, cite, and arrest data disaggregated by race and ethnicity, again, getting to data, and then looking to reinvest any kind of monies that were being spent on kind of PR kind of stuff, with the feeling that if you're doing a good job, you wouldn't need to have a PR approach. The next part of this on the next chart is that, you know, I learned a term going through this called, I guess in police language, it's shorthand is RDOs. And our thought there is that if an officer has a lot of resist, arrest or delay or obstruction, maybe that's a sign, you know, a hint, indication that this officer's got an anger problem, or maybe he's overly aggressive in his way. So we were wanting to see, what are the records of these? Are we keeping track of those things? Do we know who the officers are who have higher rates of arrest for that? We said if somebody does something wrong and they get it suspended, they shouldn't be paid while they're being suspended. Also, we wondered, has the town paid for misconduct settlements? And if there have been settlements, where are they coming from? Are they coming from our taxpayer dollars? Or are they coming from the police department? Where are those things coming from? And then we wanted to know about forfeiture programs. And then also we wanted to have localized, empowered citizen review boards as opposed to an advisory board. So this will come up in our question here on police advisory boards. So our summary chart, if we go to the next chart. So I've summarized over there under the transparency and data collection. That's all the stuff that we were interested in looking at, you know, and we just talked about. But I want to shift over here and really hear from Chief Blue. I've summarized the bullets there on a couple pages of what the police department, how they responded. So I'm going to ask Chief Blue to go ahead and give us some more detail, and then we will have an opportunity for questions on this. I want to go back because we got one question that I think will be a short answer, Chief, and that says that we have Richard Clifford asking, did I understand correctly that you have modified the policy on use of force since the last council meeting, and what changes were made? And you alluded to that in your answer, but maybe you can give a quick answer before we go leave use of force.
Sure. Yeah, we have, and we have since the last council meeting, and it is a specific prohibition on any such restraint with no exception whatsoever.
Okay, thanks. All right, so you want to talk to us about what kind of transparency and data collection responses you gave?
I will, and this is an area that's really frustrating for folks because so much of what people want to know about officers' performance, and particularly if they have a complaint about an officer or they file a complaint about an officer, they want to know what's done, if anything. And it is very difficult to share information, in fact, and other than very basic information about performance outcomes, we're bound by law, prohibited by law, from sharing information about the outcome of your complaint. And so if you file a complaint with us, the conclusion of our investigation, you will get a very unsatisfying letter from me saying we've taken the appropriate action. And I might be able to say a little bit more than that. I'm speaking generally here, but state law makes it very difficult for us to talk about personnel outcomes. We can give you information about someone's date of hire, date of promotion, date of demotion, suspension or termination, and that's about it. Which if you're looking for more information, if you had a bad experience, that's not going to be very satisfying for you. And that's not our policy. That's not our decision. In fact, there are times, I recognize the challenge in community trust when you don't get access to information about an employee with whom you about whom you have a concern. Believe me, there are times that we would love to put it up on a billboard if we could, but we're prohibited from doing that. I do think, and not to jump down to transformation, I think that's a question that communities everywhere are struggling with right now and warrants further discussion. As I said, there more often than not, I would give you more information, but in doing so, I think you would be reassured. What I will say that any and all complaints, including the ones that come in on a voicemail or on a post-it note or any other email, whatever way, they're all investigated, all of them. And we do put some aggregate information on that quarterly report about outcomes. It doesn't identify individual employees, but just kind of aggregates what we investigated that quarter and outcomes. And I encourage you to take a look at that. And again, that's another part of our quarterly report that I would imagine and hope that through our work with our task force, as well as work with our community policing advisory committee and our justice and action committees, we can improve how that information is shared. If not in terms of content, at least in terms of ease of access and maybe providing a little extra context. One thing I do want to reassure folks about, and this has not always been the case, years and years ago, you could kind of strong arm a problem employee into leaving, resigning, and you could get them out of your hair and they'd be somebody else's problem. Thankfully, that's really doesn't happen anymore. There's a state certification board that is in charge of issuing the policing licenses or certifications to every sworn officer in North Carolina. And if you leave an agency for any reason, that agency head is required to submit the circumstances of your exit, including if you were terminated or if you left under investigation. And if so, the circumstances of that investigation to minimize, if not reduce, bad actors hopping from agency to agency. I have found that to be very effective because now you can take a look at a potential applicant's file, look at the circumstances of their exit from another agency, and make an informed decision about whether you will extend them a job. Another part of what that commission does that I was describing is if they receive a notice from me about the separation of an employee from the town of Chapel Hill, perhaps terminated, and they see the details of that exit, depending on the severity of the situation that led to them leaving, they may conduct their own third-party investigation and decide not to certify that officer anymore. And that's a very rigorous investigation. So that doesn't mean that we don't still have work to do, but I'm encouraged by efforts happening at the state level to minimize the ability for someone who's had some issues to leave and go to another agency. And that's that state certification board that's referenced there. And then finally, under RDO charges, I know this is something that's being discussed both in that use of force task force I was telling you about, and hopefully in the governor's task force. As Anna said, anecdotally speaking, when I first went into police work, I was taught early in my career that, the charges of resist, delay, and obstruct are broad, and rarely should they be used because they, quite honestly, when you do see them, again, in the aggregate, they tend to be when someone has just made an officer angry. Now, that's not always the case, and there may be legitimate applications for that charge. I would say that there probably are. But sometimes you will see that those charges are used when somebody has just had an interaction with a police officer, made the police officer mad. Early in my career, and we still drive this home with our folks, that's a charge that damages your reputation in court. People generally know what that charge is, and it's everything I said 9 times out of 10. Not always, but most of the time. So to be clear, that is something that our line level supervisors monitor with their employees. We don't do an official analysis of it, although I'm not suggesting we couldn't. We just don't. We don't see them very often. And generally, when you see one, the line level supervisors take a look at it to ensure that it's in keeping with, well, ensure that it's appropriate and it's not all those things that we just express concern about. I certainly have no opposition to doing a more structured analysis of that. And I think they're good uses for that consideration. But I'll stop there and see where we go next.
All right. Well, so we think under transformation that indicators like RDO and use of force analysis together would help departments identify potential problems before they become big problems. So, and when we think about transformation, we know there's things that need to change at the North Carolina level, and we're advocating for that, and we'll talk more about next steps on some of these things at the end. Again, this is going to be a thread around reporting consistency and requirements and analysis across the state. There's some things, it's interesting. I had a friend who's a truck driver tell me that there's a national database for truck drivers who get into, have any kind of problem, and it's regulated by the FTC, and, it's a big deal. And there's no national registry for police officers who have the ability to, who carry guns. So when some of this we talk about, needs to be dealt with at the national level, but there's things here in North Carolina that we can advocate for. And I think that's something as a community we need to decide that we really want. The tracking of RDO, as I mentioned, is something we could do here locally, as well as third-party data analysis. And all of this says that understanding what's going on and why is important. There's another page to this, so I do want to get to that so we can get to the questions.
Anna, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just one quick thing about that national decertification, because you are right. There is no such national requirement. There does exist an organization that does track decertified officers, but there is no mandate that individual states participate. Now, North Carolina, that commission I told you about, does participate in that National Decertification Index, which means when they are considering certifying an out-of-state officer, they go to that index and see whether that out-of-state officer has been decertified elsewhere, and so that's good. And if that commission decertifies a North Carolina officer, similarly, they upload that into that national database. But there is no national mandate that states participate. So although North Carolina does, many do not.
So one thing, we'll talk about citizen review boards in a minute, but I gotta tell you guys, so the response we got from Chief Blue was about 15 pages. And so trying to summarize in these bullets on a charts for an hour and a half. We don't have the full answers to every question we ask on here. The PR funding one is one that we didn't put on here, and so Chief, you might talk to that. And when we get to the Q&A, that did come up here, and asset forfeiture as well. I think we did their response we do have here in terms of their asset forfeiture, so you can talk to that. On our last element that we talked about was empowered local citizen review boards. And so in looking at how do we get to that, North Carolina has another law, like the transparency and record keeping and personnel files. They have a law that really prohibits local communities from giving review boards, establishing them, and the kinds of power that they have. So we don't have review boards. Someone asked earlier, what's the difference between a task force and an advisory board? So the task force that we keep referring to is one that has come under the direction of the Chapel Hill Town Council, saying to look at reimagining safety in our community. And so that it has a strict timeline. I believe the reporting is expected out with recommendations in the March timeframe. And so that is something where it is a short duration that's going to make recommendations. The Police Advisory Board is an advisory board because we are prohibited by law from having what would be known as a review board, empowered with, a lot of people suggest subpoena power, a lot of people suggest more visibility into the depths of what goes on inside the police department, and those are impacted by the law in North Carolina. So we think if those things were going to happen, that would be something that again we need to advocate for as a community. So with that, I don't know if you want to talk about the settlements, the question that we had about settlements, and then also the forfeiture fund. And PR, quickly, I do want us to try to get to some more questions.
Sure, yeah, so quickly on the PR, we don't have a specific PR budget. And if you follow how we promote ourselves, that would be probably clear to you. We don't do a lot of that. We use social media, and we have a staff person who spends some time putting things out on social media and that kind of thing. And occasionally we'll spend some money on ads when we're recruiting. Otherwise, no specific budgetary line item around public relations. When we have an expense like a recruiting ad or something, that will generally come out of our supply accounts. Just quickly on the use of force settlements, we haven't had any of those in many, many years. I don't remember the last time we had one, but certainly not in the last 10 years. And I'm pleased about that. I hope that's reassuring news for everyone. That doesn't mean we always get it right, including every single use of force, but we haven't had any settlements in the last 10 years. Around asset forfeiture, this is a subject we could spend many, many, many hours on. And just quickly, both state and federal law allow agencies to really claim property and funds and other items as that are believed to be proceeds from criminal activity, and use those for departments. And you might example you might think of most often would be maybe a vehicle that was believed to be used in drug sales, and that vehicle seized as evidence in a case, and then at the conclusion of that case given to the department by the for example. That's one example. We don't do a lot of that. I think the current balance we have in our forfeiture fund is about $15,000. That was left over from a large multi-jurisdictional drug case from a few years ago. Not our case, actually, but we provided some investigative support, and the agency that seized those funds did give us a portion of those funds. In fact, that helped us establish our body camera program. And there are limits on how those funds can be spent. We also know that those programs can be abused, and I know that's why the question is in there. That's one that's probably worth talking about in greater detail in a future setting, but I will reassure you that that's not something we engage in very often at all.
We've got a couple questions going here, so let's go to our question slide. One of them talks about the fact that when Frank Baumgartner found that Orange County and Chapel Hill were among the worst for traffic stop discrepancies with Black citizens, and the question is, has that statistic improved since then?
Yeah, it's improved, just like a lot of our areas of disparity have improved. But that, improvement is not enough. I mean, regulatory traffic stops are a good example. Low-level marijuana enforcement, good example of areas that you emphasized for a long time, and you've seen numbers come down, and you've seen the disparities close up some. But we also know that as long as there's still a disparity there, then de-emphasizing just didn't get it done. And so, yeah, Dr. Baumgartner's work was enlightening. It was enlightening to all of us when he first published it 8 or 10 years ago, because it's not necessarily how you imagine the outcomes of your work. We have seen improvement. I know absolutely that council's decisive action around banning regulatory traffic stops, which tend to be disproportionately impactful on communities of color, that can make a significant difference. And I think later on, as we talk more about low-level misdemeanor marijuana enforcement, another area of great disparity, there's an opportunity to think creatively there too.
All right, any other questions I don't see any other questions. I think I answered the one, we're coming up on the one that's going to be around mental health. So we still got that one on the deck, and I don't see any other ones. So let's get to our third area on our agenda, was hiring and retention. And again, this is the slide that we had in our original agenda. And it talks about what are the hiring practices, making sure that we don't hire folks that are members of white supremacist groups, for example. And what do we do to make sure we're not hiring officers who have been fired or resigned under duress? How are we including mental health and bias assessment in our criteria? How are we making sure we've got a diverse workforce? And I think there's a couple more on the next slide there, talking about what is our training regimen, and then really saying, how can we incentivize and reward a better qualified smaller force focused on public safety. So I'm going to go right to our summary chart here, because I think that's where people want to see what your answers were to these questions. So again, we've got things summarized over there under hiring and retention. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your process on what you do when you're hiring, and we can get to some questions in this area as well.
Sure, yeah. So the hiring process, although local agencies make their own hiring decisions, I've talked a lot about that, that Criminal Justice Standards Commission that I was telling you about before, that manages the certification of officers. And so this is an area where standardization is pretty good across the state. The processes can always be improved, but any sworn officer who is being considered for hire by any agency in North Carolina has a pretty standardized set of processes that they have to go through to make that hire. That can be supplemented at the local level. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But it is pretty rigorous, and it's long, and it requires a very standard set of questions, background steps, and clearances and so on. So that's good. It's a long process. If you were to put an application in today, even in an accelerated process, it would probably be 5 months before a job offer was issued to you. So it's a long process, and it includes multiple interviews. It includes interviews with references, includes interviews with people who you didn't put down as references. I mean, really conduct an investigation into every applicant. And part of that process requires medical screening, but perhaps most importantly, mental health screening. And that mental health screening, by law, requires an in-person clinical interview with every applicant. That's a big part of why it takes so long to get these hiring processes done, is to get those scheduled with a third party who has the credentials to conduct those interviews. Takes a long time. Good thing about that, though, is not only can they ask a standardized set of questions that get at the kinds of things we would all want to know about an applicant, it also allows them to follow up on things that may come up in the background or in previous interviews or part of employee or the applicant's personal history statement for further exploration. And then finally, we polygraph all of our employees. And to be honest, and that's not required, and a lot of places don't, most places don't do that, in fact, and it is an extra expense and it's an extra step. But I will tell you, you find out things before you ever hook them up to the machine. When they realize they're about to sit down and get plugged into this instrument, you find out things that you hadn't found out before. So I've found that to be an invaluable instrument and one that we'll continue to use. That analysis by the clinician is intended to get at questions about bias. If you ask those clinicians, they will tell you that they feel pretty good about their ability to do that well, but that they know that that is not a foolproof system. And I think that's right. So, you know, to say we're successfully evaluating someone's bias, I don't have great confidence in that just yet. But it certainly is an area that's tackled in those interviews. Let me stop for a second and see if there's questions about that.
Okay, so you're wanting, if there's questions just about the hiring piece?
Well, I didn't actually, let me hit the last couple bullets real quickly. I'm sorry, I stopped a little bit too quickly. We do mandate that our officers go through crisis intervention training, as well as implicit bias and other kinds of racial equity training. There are a variety of those opportunities out there, as many of you all know, and we try to take advantage of a variety of them to keep material fresh for our employees and keep them engaged in those important conversations. Dispute Settlement Center has helped us lead some of that training, as has the Racial Equity Institute. And that state certification board I talked about has some kind of either bias or diversity related or racial equity training as part of our mandatory training every year. We are mandated by the state. In addition to whatever training we decide as a department we want officers to do every year, the state also mandates at least 24 hours of a standardized update or continuing ed. And oftentimes, in fact, every year it has some element of racial equity or diversity kind of training in there. And then finally, and this is also referenced in Council's June 24th resolution, is the continued exploration of the Government Alliance on Racial Equity as an instrument and a framework for how we do our work in this community. I'm excited about that. I mean, it really is this notion of building a culture where your racial equity lens helps you evaluate all of how you do business. We're thinking that as this task force gets up and running, some of those CARE principles will help inform their work, and encourage folks to stay tuned there and ask good questions. So now I will stop.
Okay, we have another chart on this page, I believe, on hiring and retention, and it really gets to some of the training stuff. And so the hiring and retention side, our agenda side is pretty much the same, but your response side has a couple other things in it that I think would be good for you to address, and then we'll quickly talk about transformation and get some of these. I do have at least one question up on this.
Yeah, thank you. I forgot we had another slide here. I touched a little bit on this. I mean, we mandate in our policies that that officers have some kind of racial equity training, and using that term loosely and broadly, every year. And that's critically important. We were early adopters of the fair and impartial policing curriculum that really takes a deep dive into the effects of implicit bias on how we do our jobs. We along with other Orange County agencies, brought in a national trainer, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago now, to train some of our in-house staff to be instructors themselves, and we've delivered that training ever since here internally, and occasionally we'll also bring in outside consultants who have some specialized curriculum to offer. I mentioned Dispute Settlement Center is a good example. It's also a trainer out of Wake County who does some really interesting interactive kinds of sessions where he brings community members in to interact with officers and talk about ways to build bridges and trust. So we'll continue to look for opportunities to do that. And again, imagine as we move into the fall, into the spring, that some of those recommendations may come out of the task force work. Another part of council's resolution, this kind of staying with the idea of hiring and retention, council's resolution also directed that we do some study around what's the right size of a staff to have here in the town of Chapel Hill in terms of personnel. And I think that dovetails nicely in with the conversation about reallocating resources, that defund the police idea of making sure you're spending your resources in the most appropriate places in the most appropriate ways. And I think that's a really important conversation. And I think we'll get to that more later on in today's discussion, but there's certainly things that we are asked to do right now that we don't do very well and that might be better served by another organization. And if then holding our line on staffing allows those kinds of services to be provided better elsewhere, and some reallocation of resources would enable that to happen, we certainly support that idea. And again, look forward to saying more about that probably before we wrap up today.
Okay, great. Yeah, for transformation, and again, I'm going to touch briefly because we do want to get to questions. But in your response, we weren't sure if it seemed that the training that was going on and the assessment that was going on, it wasn't clear if it was every year, was it recurring, what was the frequency, what kind of training. So there was some racial equity training most years. So what we're saying, in a transformational environment, there would be regular, I don't know what that regular means in terms of fitness assessment from a psychological and racial bias standpoint, as well as ongoing training of every member of the force. That we're supportive of competitive compensation to employees so that we'd have officers who lived in our community. And we think that in a transformational world, you'd have officers who were part of the community and were able to afford to live here. That community involvement in the hiring process would demystify and be a part of the accountability. And then really that in a transformed community, we would have a changed narrative about what policing means in our town, what part, and I think this is part of what we as a community need to continue to talk about, is that we have the police that we have the police department and the policies and practices that we have as a community have asked for, whether we think that we've asked for it explicitly or not. And so I think the whole narrative about what is safety in the community, who's protecting who, and how that happens, that narrative in a transformed society would change. So I'm really anxious to make sure we're gonna not get all the way through our agenda. This is clear, so we're gonna have a session 2, it looks like. But for sure, one question has come up that I think is really important. So if we'll go to our question slide on training, hiring, retention, there's a question about what trainings are Chapel Hill Police Department employees, officers, and administrative staff involved with to ensure fair and unbiased treatment of LGBTQ citizens in our town.
Some of the same, I mentioned that required annual training that the state does. We've actually, I'm thinking in the last 5 years, don't hold me to this exactly, and I'll get an answer to share with the membership that's exactly correct. I can think of a couple different things over the last 5 years, specifically around LGBTQ response and relationship building. Not enough by any stretch. There's no question about that. And sadly, I know for a fact there aren't many models out there to follow that are coming through the law enforcement side of things. So I'll get you a better answer about what the state has required of us. And it's not, the town identified LGBTQ liaison. She has since left employment with the town, and I don't believe we appointed another one, but that's an area where we need to do work. There's no question about that. We have not done enough there.
Okay, the other question I have, when in our transformation scenario, we said all, every member of the force, and the question was for us is, does that refer to all staff within the department, all the way from officers to leadership to front desk staff? And the answer to that was, that's what we mean when we said every member of the force. Yes.
Yeah, same here. And in fact, I didn't mention this, but we also have a career progression program for both line level employees and supervisory staff. And there are milestones that you have to achieve in order to actually advance in your career, and particularly in the supervisory track. If you want to be an executive level employee here, you will have gone through the REI training at least once. And be able to speak some of that language that you get from that powerful training. So yes, and again, we always can do more. I mean, there's no question about that. And welcome suggestions about additional training opportunities. I mean, we're all in. We mandate it every year, but I also think that an array of different training options keeps the conversation fresh. And you can count on us to continue to seek it out. But if folks are aware of training opportunities they think would make sense, we'd love to hear about them.
One point that's really a national issue around forfeiture funds, in the sense that they are allowed before the person's been tried to be confiscated. And so is that really a constitutional issue around rights of the individual who should be presumed innocent until proven guilty? So that's a great point. Thank you for that. Okay, we are 15 minutes away from our scheduled end time, and we have covered the first 3 elements of the agenda, but I want to quickly, if So we'll go to the next chart, which is really around investing in community. Let's go straight to the summary chart that has summary, because there's a lot on this chart. So let's try to deal with this, and it really talks to the mental health question that came up earlier, and some of the other initiatives going on in our town. We talked about the right sizing of the department, the over-policing, neighborhood councils, taking the crisis unit out of law enforcement, expanding harm reduction techniques, funding community violence prevention and intervention skills training. Go to the next chart, please. I just want to run down what was included in there. Repurposing buildings to house the homeless. Making sure that queer and trans youth have non-coercive housing, extending rent amnesty. So this investing in the community, what we were trying to get at, and I'm summarizing here, was really what are we as a town going to be willing to do to transform our how we handle issues in our town that lead to interactions with law enforcement, so that we're improving the lives of citizens. And so there was a lot of this. Go back to the other chart, please. There's a lot of this, thank you. There's a lot of this that isn't directly in the control of the police, and I recognize that. But you did respond to a lot of what was said. So maybe you could summarize your view, your responses here, and then we can look at transformation on this one as well.
Sure. I'll hit these quickly because I know we're running short on time. So around rejecting expanded budgets. So part of our council's resolution on June 24th was to really freeze any increase in staffing or positions in the police department while the task force does its work and thinking about what's the appropriate staffing level in this community. And I couldn't agree with that more. We know that there are a number of calls to which we are dispatched that we are not the right answer. That's just all there is to it. And I'll say more about that near the bottom of this slide. So I think that makes good sense, and it gives us a chance for the community to really see where funds are going. You know, our budget, about 88 or 89% of it is people. There's very little discretionary spending outside of paying for salary and benefits and healthcare for folks. So if we are going to think about reallocating, there's very little discretionary funding there outside of those personnel costs. So the conversation about reallocation will most certainly include conversations about positions, not just buying less of one product or another. We certainly think that neighborhood groups and neighborhood involvement and engagement with each other potentially has the benefit of needing police less often. Some of you may have been on a call that we did with the Southern Village community about 6 weeks ago, where we talked about the fact that neighbors don't talk to each other very much anymore, and they certainly don't organize together very much anymore like they used to. I certainly support that. Early in my career, I was one of our community policing officers, and a significant part of my job was coming to community watch meetings and representing the department, providing crime data for neighborhoods to then decide what they want to do with that information. And that really doesn't happen anymore. I'm not suggesting that was the greatest model under the sun, but it was an example of communities coming together and agreeing on issues and tackling them together. And I certainly like the idea of getting back to that. We get an awful lot of calls, in my opinion, and this is no judgment on anybody, we get an awful lot of 911 calls that very likely could have been handled with a neighbor just talking to another neighbor. That's not always the right remedy, but so much of the time it is. And so any way we can support that and encourage that, we want to be part of that. I want to just hit quickly before we run out of time around the opportunity to support other agencies that are trying to do good work in our community. Orange County was able to secure some funding for a year's worth of funding to stand up this harm reduction kind of street level crisis worker unit that would help folks who are chronically homeless, who are perhaps oftentimes also suffering from mental health and substance abuse issues, who don't have a place to stay and are not able to consistently get treatment, but about whom we get 911 calls often. And we know we are not the right answer 99 out of 100 times to someone who is experiencing any of those challenges, much less multiple examples of those challenges. And that's just going to take a commitment. The county was able to find some funds to do that for a year, but to sustain that program, communities are going to have to decide it's worthwhile. And why I know it's worthwhile is the fact that we get a lot of 911 calls from businesses and from visitors to our downtown who see someone who sits on a bench and maybe they live on that bench. Maybe that's the only place they have to be, and they're clearly in need of some services, and we can't fix that yet. We get the 911 call and we go. And we know that the jail is the worst place for most people who are suffering under those conditions. But we don't have, quite honestly, in this resource-rich community of ours, it's surprising how few and limited the services are to provide support to those folks. And so we've got the beginnings of a model that I think will be hugely impactful. And I hope folks will stay involved as the funding discussions for subsequent years develop around supporting that Orange County harm reduction model and street level outreach workers. And another reason I think that's important, and it kind of goes back up to that holding the line on staffing. Of all of our calls for service in the downtown Chapel Hill area, so that's the central business district and the neighborhoods immediately adjacent, about 21% of our calls for service in that area have to do with those kinds of quality of life calls that oftentimes are associated with that population I was describing of people who need help and support. So if we were getting them help and support that beyond what our police department could provide, then we'll get 21% of our staff time back that can be used in other ways or could be offset by some of this right sizing of our staffing. We want folks to know we support that. Folks go into this work to solve problems and to help make positive change. And there are some problems that a police officer just is simply not the right answer. So as Anna said, communities have to decide where they want to spend their energy and their resources. And I think supporting those folks who are most in need right now and most underrepresented, and there's a path out before us here with this pilot program. So I hope folks will pay attention to that, lend their voice to it if they support it, and look for updates periodically over the next year or so as to how successful that is. To me, that's a really good example of investing in communities and pairing that with this discussion about what we want policing to look like.
Okay, let's see. Go down to the next chart where we talk about transformation just briefly, and I really think that what we're saying here in all this language about investing in our community is really talking about how we prioritize the engagement of the community in decision making, how we reallocate our priorities and our resources to support that engagement, and how we manage safety and reduce criminal justice involvement through harm reduction. So it's really a whole different way of looking at safety in our communities and where we put our emphasis. The mental health issue came up earlier, and I know that this is something that the task force is going to look at. Also, I did have one person put in the chat where they saw a really good handling of a mental health situation. So that was a call out to you, Chris, in terms of your department handling a situation in a good way. Given our time, we've got 5 minutes here. I don't have any other questions on this in the community, but what I'm going to suggest, we've gotten through 4 elements, and what we can do is come back, and we can do that fairly soon since we got the charts already made up, Chris. We can just pick up these same charts. We don't have to do another presentation, but we can do a part 2 of this. What I would like to go to, though, is the last chart in the deck, which talks about next steps, just in case folks aren't able to join us at the end. And I think the reimagined justice, the schools, the SROs and the schools is one that keep going to the very last chart. I think there should be one about next steps. Okay,
yeah, there we go.
We know that the school board has the purview over police and schools, and when we talk about transformation, I think that'll be a really rich conversation. So we'll look forward to that, and we'll schedule something on that. But I do just want to let folks know that this work from an NAACP perspective, this work is continuing in terms of reviewing the responses. You might think, my God, what takes so long? Well, I said that Chief Blue's response was about 15, 16 pages. We got responses that ranged from 7 pages to 47 pages. So from individual jurisdictions. So we're trying to go through each one, looking as we did here with Chris, and also trying to meet with them one-on-one. So that process is still going on, and we just got our responses from Chatham County, so we're involved there as well. What we want to do is try to prioritize what are the actionable items within the purview of local jurisdictions, so that we can make some headway towards transformation. Some of that is state stuff, and we got to advocate for that. We hope people will engage with the task force that the town is putting together, and we're going to be monitoring what the governor's task force is doing to see if there are things there that we can quickly implement here in Orange and Chatham County, because whatever they come up with, it's going to come back to the counties and individual jurisdictions to get them implemented. So we'll be pushing very, very hard for quick implementation of anything that comes out of there. Chris, did you want to say a quick word about, I think you put in the chat the info about the, or maybe Margaret did, about the task force, how to apply.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret, because I forgot to do that. So thank you. Yeah, so the task force, anyone who wants to apply to the task force can do so through the end of this coming week. I want to say they close on the 25th. I think that's right. I know council is looking for a wide array of applicants that they can consider for inclusion in the group. So I think any and everybody should apply, no matter what you think you have to say, or maybe or don't feel like you don't have to say. I encourage you to get in there, because they're really looking for folks who have had specific experiences with the criminal justice system and who are willing to bring those to the conversation. So I hope folks will take advantage of that. And also, I just put my contact information on here. I mean, for 2 reasons. One, we want to hear from you on how we're doing, and I really mean that. And I hope folks have seen evidence of that over the years. And if not, I need to hear that too. And then finally, to invite us to your next conversation, whether it's through NAACP, or whether it's a neighborhood group, or whether it's a church group or some other organization with which you're affiliated. We get our best information about how our community wants us to police by coming out and talking to you and answering questions and having an exchange. So we look forward to those opportunities, and we'll try to make it effort to make every single one of those. So please include us. And we'll look forward to continuing this because we have some more stuff to talk about.
Okay, so I want to just note that the deadline for applying is the 28th of September. So you've got a little over a week and a day to get your applications in. And also there is another conversation with the Police Advisory Board going on next week, and we'll be rescheduling. We'll be scheduling our community update part 2 so that we can spend time on what Reimagined Justice looks like, and also finish our conversation on investing in the community. So with that, I appreciate everyone being here. Please stay safe, wear your mask, stay socially distanced, and please come as we continue the conversation. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Anna.